The hollow bell in the chapel throat had stopped tolling long before anyone dared speak. Rain came in sheets now, carving black rivers down Main Street. Lanterns hiccuped as wind took them by the throat. People pressed close under awnings and wagon covers, faces half lost in shadow, watching like animals waiting to see which one would bleed first. She stood at the edge of the wooden steps without looking up, hair sodden and hanging like a curtain of old rope. There was no bridal veil, no white. Her dress was a dull thing, the color of river mud, pinned and patched and worn down where someone had once rested a head against it. When she moved her hands, the town noticed how steady they were, an odd steadiness where most grief left only tremors. Between the congregation of townsfolk and the chapel steps, a patch of mud reflected lightning in a silver-shattering tongue. Sheriff Crow had his hat in his hands and his jaw set. The preacher's hymnal lay open and useless on the pulpit, water darkening ink into blurred sermons. Mothers drew children close. Men spat into the dirt more often than they spoke. The eyes that looked at her were not pitying. They were hungry with verdicts. She took a knife from her belt. The sound it made, metal whispering leather, cut through the patter of rain. No one expected the next motion. She leaned forward and drew the blade through hair. Not in a quick, hysterical snip, but with a practiced, deliberate pull. Strands fell into the mud in small, wet curls. The sound was not loud, but in that breathless moment it held thunder. She pulled the hair until it made a blunt, ragged cross at the center of her head. A crude sign, coppered by rain and blood from a thumb she seemed not to notice. For a second the town's noise fell like a curtain. A child's cry broke it, short and confused, and then a low murmur like wind rustling through old oaks. "Name?" Sheriff Crow's voice came out thin. He wanted a name to hang on the action, a label to pin to her like a wanted poster. The question landed and sank. Her chin lifted. The rain streaked tracks down her cheeks and did what it could to erase the fingerprints of her sorrow. But the cross, raw and honest, remained. "Eveline Marrs," she said, each syllable picked out like a stone. "I come for what they took." There it was, the word that made teeth grind. A dozen men shifted on their heels. Eveline's voice didn't plead, it convened. She stepped down from the top stair and the porch boards creaked under her boots, each creak a footnote to the town's long memory. She did not move toward the gallows. No. The gallows waited like an accusation on Main, but straight to the center of town, to a place where men had once spat whiskey into the dust and called it mercy. People whispered names passed like contraband. Her husband's, Colter Marrs, slipped out between clenched teeth in more than one mouth. Others said he had been taken by, called themselves lawmen, by the cold that comes when a frontier man is no longer useful. The story shifted with every telling, like smoke refusing to hold a shape. Eveline listened as if she'd heard it all her life. She placed the cross of hair over her heart, palm flat, as if the hair itself were a talisman or a warrant. The motion was small, private, and grand all at once. "They burned his boots at the fair," she said, not to the sheriff but to the air, and the memory struck like a match struck across tinder. Someone swore. Someone laughed too loud, and someone, old Martha with hands like gnarly roots, hid her face against her shawl. Eveline's thumb left a thin red line where the knife grazed her skin. She didn't step back from it. When she spoke again, it was to the whole town. "I will wear this until I see what remains of Colter, or until they return his name with flesh and apology. I swear it on the only thing I have left." Her voice, though not loud, found the bones of the town and shook them. Between oath and action, there is always a minute for a crowd to decide whether the world is about to shift or whether it will make the usual, safe choice of indifference. Tonight, the choice made a sound. Two men spat and stamped, but a pair of young boys removed their hats and hunched like lambs. Someone from the sheriff's side muttered about lunacy and law. Others felt something more dangerous, sympathy that smelled like firewood and looked like reckoning. The rain, as if tired of listening, eased to a fine drizzle, and the lanterns blew steady. Eveline wiped her face with the back of her wrist and slid the knife home. The cross of hair glistened dark, and in the reflection of a puddle, a face stared back. Different than before. Not quite victim, not quite accused, but bent toward verdict. She stepped back up the chapel stairs, not to the pulpit, but to the shadow under the eaves. And for the first time the crowd saw the way she'd cut herself free. "If you want to know what that oath costs a town," she said in a voice that was both invitation and challenge, "watch close. What you shout tonight might be the thing you apologize for tomorrow." By the time the rain eased to a fine mist, the town had decided it would not be merely a rumor's stage. A small party formed, with the awkward courage of people who had not expected to act. Jonah Pike, the stable hand with knuckles like rope. Old Tom Fletcher, who smelled of fence tar and had patched more wounds than shirts. Luke, the eager grandson with more heart than sense. And Baird, a slow-talking ox cart driver whose arms could yoke a mule or a temper. Sheriff Crow sent them off with a ledger's caution. "Bring word back. No vigilante work." Eveline did not argue. She put her boots in the stirrups and tightened the cinch, as if the motion had been bred into her. The chapel steps creaked as the town watched them leave, a small, ragged line moving out of Sundown Ridge into country that smelled of iron and salt. Tracks in the churned clay showed the tale. Wagon ruts, horse prints, the shallow drag of a bundle that had been carried and then abandoned. They followed the spoor toward the salt flats, past homesteads that sagged with old winters and a burned encampment where a blackened wheel still hummed the echo of flames. There they found what made rumor a man. A half-charred boot with a scuffed toe and a curl of leather Eveline knew like a fingerprint. She held it, and something in her chest, tuned like a bell, struck clean. Her breath left her in a small sound that was almost prayer. Evidence came in quiet fragments. A tin cup snapped in two, a strap with initials half legible, a smear of dried blood on reed post, signs stitched together into a map no one wanted, but everyone followed. The trail led on, narrowing into marsh and reed, where the land kept secrets and the sky ran low with clouds that worried the horizon. They moved with care. Jonah kept his hand near his pistol but did not brandish it. Baird hummed under his breath, like a man steadying breath for a long haul. Tom's eyes found tracks and read them like old scripture. Luke rode close to Eveline, silent and pale, as if courage could be swallowed by marsh mist. On the second day's thin light, a rider broke from the reeds. He came alone, hat pulled low, horse muttering through the wet grass. The man's voice carried, rough, ledger paper coarse. "You lookin' for Colter Marrs?" he called. Eveline's boots dug into the sod without a hitch. "Who asks?" she answered. "Name's Gage." He circled them slow, ledger of a smile, and a red scrap of cloth tied to his saddle, the kind of token men carry for debtors and bargains. "I know where a man wearing Colter's boots camped." His eyes skimmed Eveline like a prospector appraising ore. Ash that still crawled in her throat. "I have my last silver," she said, "and I ask only truth." Gage laughed, a bright cut of sound. "Silver buys a start," he said, "but favors by the road." He spat to punctuate it. "Bring me his hat and I'll tell you where to look." Bring me his hat and a promise you can pay. Before negotiations could twist, other shadows stirred at the reed line. 3 riders, quiet as thieving crows. They did not approach, only watched like fence-post ghosts. The marsh kept its own counsel. Even the birds avoided the spot. Then from the rise beyond, hoofbeats answered like a second heart. Not lone horses, but many. An approaching thunder that made men tighten reins and hearts in the chest. A banner unfurled on the distant ridge. White cloth, with a crude painted mark none of them could make out in the mist. The sound of so many hooves made the marsh itself lean away. Eveline felt the old oath she'd made in the rain change shape. It was no longer a private vow, but a road with others already walking it, toward a reckoning. Jonah dropped his gaze to the pistol. Tom's hand hovered over a knife. Luke swallowed. Baird muttered a prayer to no god in particular. Gage's face softened for a half-breath. "You don't want these on your heels," he said, nodding toward the rising tide of riders. "They collect wrong turns and hand them out like fines. If they're salt riders, they'll trade names for silence." His tone was neither threat nor offer, but a ledger. Facts to be paid. The riders crested the rise, and the lead man rode forward, broad-shouldered, face a map of old sun and fine scars. He wore no official mark, but had a presence that bent the air. "Colter Marrs," he said simply, as if confirming a grocery list. "We were looking for him before you were trouble." Attention stretched like a taut wire. Town law and salt law met in the marsh where mud remembered every step. Eveline pressed her hand to the cross of hair at her chest, as if it were an anchor. "Tell me where," she said, and the voice that answered was not small. The broad man's horse stamped. "We know a place," he said, "but knowing it and fetching a man are different things. You'll need to be willing to leave Sundown behind for a night. That doesn't end without fire." His eyes slid to Eveline, then to Jonah. "And we don't do favors for free." The marsh closed around them like a throat. Choices, like gunpowder, smelled different once the fuse was lit. Eveline tasted iron and the promise of road. Around her, the small party waited, all of them caught between the comfort of an oath and the shape of the price. She tightened her grip on the boot in her lap, and let the silence answer first. Because sometimes, more name, one more reckoning, and the cost already beginning to count. The flats smelled of salt and old embers when they pushed past Sundown's last roofline. The salt riders' country kept its accounts in footprints and burned circles. The land itself taught a hard sword of arithmetic. Eveline rode with the half-burned boot on her knee, the cross at her throat like a small, stubborn relic. Mile by mile, Sundown fell behind, until it was no more than a memory of chimneys and the chapel spire. They found the riders at dusk, a ring of low fires that shivered across the plain like bruises, men and horses huddled under patchwork blankets. Faces were half-lit, all angles and old weather. Eyes that measured coin and favors the same way some men measured calories. The leader, a broad-shouldered man who called himself Harlan, watched Eveline with a patient, dangerous attention. "You don't come for gossip," Harlan said when she dismounted. Salt ground crunched under her boots. Sparks popped in the embers, bright as small confessions. "You come for tab or favor." Around him the riders shifted, slow and cold as fish. Eveline set the charred boot at Harlan's feet. The leather whispered against salt dust. He turned it, thumb over the scuff, like a man who reads a ledger by touch. "Payment first," he said, "not always coin." Jonah's hand twitched near his pistol. Baird kept his shoulders squared. Tom's face drew long with old calculations. Eveline felt the town's ledger press into her chest. "I'll pay what I have," she said, "and I will answer what you ask, within reason. I want him back, with his name whole." Harlan considered, then waved a man forward. "We can fetch a man from the flats," he said, "but the reclaim takes things, sometimes coin, sometimes service, sometimes a token of barter that draws a line. You stay the night, answer our questions. We hold your promise. You live by our terms for that moon. A reclaim. The word tasted of cold wind. Jonah's jaw hardened. Luke looked like he might speak, and then folded his mouth shut. The Salt Rider's culture was ledger, and ledger's thirst. What was owed could be called in later, in ways that made a person owe beyond coin. They rode deeper into the flats, under a sky that felt low with threat. The salt glassed under hoof, throwing back a thin white light that made faces look unreal. Harlan's men moved like a single organism, soft and exact. They came at last to a shallow hollow where wagon ruts cut the plain, and a cart once burned lay like a ribcage. Under tarps and blankets, the lean-to smelled of smoke and old cloth. Harlan lifted a tarp and the sight hit like wind. A man, bound and ragged, face dirt-streaked, and eyes barely open. Evelyn's breath thinned. Colter's face, when she saw it, sounded like a match struck. They took the hat. They march at moon. Evelyn's fingers found the cross at her throat until the skin whitened. Around them, the riders watched with the clinical calm of those who weigh risk like sacks. Harlan's face was unreadable. "We can take him back," he said finally. "But the reclaim is not always what folks expect. You pay in nights and answers. Or you pay in a head." Luke's protest came, fresh and fierce. "You can't trade a life for favors none of us see," he said. The rider's laugh was not kind. Evelyn thought of Colter's small mercies, the way he'd mend a fence post without cursing, the way he fed his horse before himself. She thought of the burned boot in her lap and the scent of ash in her nose. She thought of promises made under rain. "I'll stay," she said. "I'll answer what you ask. I won't trade his life for a stranger's debt." Harlan inclined his head, like a man who'd been given an exact coin. "First, then, tell us the oath you swore in Sundown," he said. "Words have worth out here. We settle accounts by truth and by fear." Evelyn repeated the oath, short, fierce. She would wear the cross until she saw Colter returned, or the town returned his name, with flesh and apology. The riders listened as if the words themselves were currency. As the moon rose, and the firelight carved faces into maps of old debts, a shadow moved from the line of riders. A man stepped forward and set something on a stump, a hat, crushed at the brim, and ash still clinging. Evelyn lunged before thought. The hat was a small planet of memory. Her fingertips brushed it. Then the man's hand closed over her wrist. Firm, not cruel, but with the finality of a ledger closing. "Keep still," he said. "You asked for truth. Truth sometimes takes a hand." At that moment, hoofbeats erupted from the ridge. Many horses, the sound like a second sky of thunder. A shout answered, and a single gunshot cracked the plain. The night folded into motion. A horse reared. A man swore. A lantern tipped and threw sparks like angry fireflies. Evelyn felt the floor shift beneath her. The hat lay half free under the man's thumb. A tether to what she hoped was still whole. Around her, decisions spun into action. The reclaim was a promise, and promises in the flats never paid in silver alone. Whatever came next would be bought with more than coin, by nights stayed, favors given. Night in the flats had a different grammar. Sounds were sharper, the creak of leather, the scrape of a boot in salt, the small, precise language of men who had learned to talk with less. Eveline woke to a low fire and riders moving like machinery, checking tack and counting small things as if they were coins. Colter lay on a blanket between two ponies, his breathing a shallow, stubborn sound. Harlan's terms unfolded with the efficiency of a ledger. The reclaim would bind Eveline to a night of tasks, questions she must answer, errands she must run across the flats while the riders watched. In exchange, they would put their hands on retrieving Colter, a ride back to Sundown with a man carried and not left for wolves. "You keep your word," Harlan said, "and we keep ours. Break it, and you learn the flats collect more than favors." Jonah hovered like a shadow, close enough to help, distant enough to be himself. Luke kept glancing at Colter, the boy's jaw tight with a mixture of hope and dread. Eveline kept touching the cross at her throat, as if feeling the shape could steady her. She had bargained in the rain. Here the price lived like a thing with teeth. Tasks began with small requests: fetch water from a well the riders kept hidden, carry a message across a gully, stand with a lantern while two riders inspected tracks that led away. Each task was a test of nerve and of what a person would yield when pressed: time, warmth, a favor traded, a secret given. Once, Harlan asked Eveline to speak the names of 3 men she trusted most in Sundown. Another time, she was ordered to ride alone to a patch of salt, to retrieve a token and bring it to the leader without speaking. Each thing drew a line through the night, the ledger scoring her. Between tasks, there were moments like trapped breaths, a laugh that tasted like iron, a look from Colter that never fully met her, a whispered question from Jonah: "When you married him, did you know he'd hold on?" And she would answer in ways that were tiny and absolute. The riders watched, their faces carved by firelight into lessons about what obligates a person beyond coin. Around midnight, as the moon cut a thin silver through clouds, a rider returned late from a patrol, breathing like a man who'd seen wind in his teeth. He had followed a set of fresh tracks to a low rise and found signs. A piece of torn canvas, a smear of something red that had soaked into the salt. "They move at moon," he said. "They sweep small groups and trade names in ledgers. We can find them tonight, if we ride hard and true." The news set the camp in motion. Harlan's men readied, no fanfare, only the organized violence of people who handled danger as a line item. Eveline felt the old oath tremble under her breath, lit by moon and a handful of lanterns. The flats opened like a pale ocean, and the salt hissed under their horses. Riders moved with a single thought: close fast, take minimal risk, get the man. Eveline rode beside Jonah, her hands white on the reins, the cross at her throat beating like a tiny drum. They found the camp, not far past a rib of rock and old axle. 3 fires glowed weak. Men came and went with slow hands. The salt riders spread like a net, soft and sudden. Harlan split his force, 2 groups to circle, 1 to bait. Eveline's breath was a bell. Luke's face had the fever of a prayer. The strike cut the night. Lanterns slashed the dark and men moved like images learning to be real. Shouts. A single gunshot. The smell of burned cloth and hurry. Eveline saw figures scattering, heard a cry that might have been Colter's name. In the chaos, she ran, not toward a hulking silhouette, but toward a low tarp where shadow and light tangled. Hands closed on her arms, rough, human. Then a shape rolled, and a flinch of movement exposed a face. For a second, She thought it would not be him, that hope had misread everything. Then Colter's eyes opened, mud and blood streaked, and he whispered like a thing waking from a fever. "Eve." Jonah's fist found a jaw. Luke held a lantern high. Soldiers of the Salt Riders worked with a brutal courtesy, binding those who had been taking names in ledgers. Harlan stood, a figure carved by lamp spark, and when he looked at Eveline, there was some small settlement in his gaze. They brought Colter out on a cart, with a blanket over him. His breath was ragged but in the world. Eveline rode with him, like someone carrying a map home, each mile a stitch. But the night had left its accounts. 2 men in the dark had been killed. A rider's arm was broken, and the Salt Riders had taken 2 names as a cost. Reclaims were economical things. To give was also to take. At dawn, Sundown's roof lines crawled into view, pale and uncertain. Eveline held Colter and felt the ledger's aftertaste. Relief ringed with the knowledge that debts had shifted. Harlan watched as they rolled into town and said, offhand, "Keep your promise. We marked our favor. Mark yours." Eveline nodded, knowing the words meant more than a nod. The night had been paid for with more than silver. She had learned what Reclaim demanded: nights given, favors owed, small things kept in memory that might be called due. But dawn in Sundown tasted of wet wood and the thin tobacco smoke that clings to porches. Word moved ahead of them like a rumor with hooves. Colter was coming. Colter was alive. People gathered where they always gather, near the well, by the saloon door, hands finding one another the way old debts find new ledgers. Eveline rode through the town as if returning from a pilgrimage that smelled of salt and blood. They wheeled into Main Street, with Colter half sitting, eyes half open, a blanket over his knees. A ripple ran through the crowd, first awe, then questions like knives. Sheriff Crow pushed forward, hat off, face set to count the cost lest the town forget it. Mothers clutched shawls tighter. Luke's cheeks burned like a lamb who has spoken truth. Eveline dismounted and put Colter gently on the steps of the chapel, where the weathered wood had already drunk several storms. People reached and then paused. The act of touching him was like reopening a ledger. Harlan and a pair of Salt Riders waited by the edge of town like collectors waiting for signatures. Jonah lingered back, hands empty but steady, the quieting presence of someone who had kept to other people's pain. "You did what you said," Sheriff Crow said without warmth. "You brought him back." Eveline looked at Colter, at the split lip, at the dirt embedded under a fingernail. "We brought him back," she said. Her voice did not ask them to change their faces. It only named what had been done. The crowd, which earlier had shouted and lit torches for justice, now found itself in the strange house of having to accept what it had not paid to earn. Harlan stepped forward, boots leaving salt dust on the chapel step. He regarded the town like a man who's balanced an account and found it wanting. "The reclaim is paid," he said. "We hold our end." There was a ledger's finality in his words. "You owe a promise to men you didn't call. We'll ride when we are summoned. Remember that." Sheriff Crow swallowed. The sheriff's role was a ledger too. Keep the town from tearing itself apart while pretending the cost sits elsewhere. He tipped his chin at Harlan, an uneasy courtesy, and turned to Eveline. "There's talk of payment," Crow said. "What will you offer, Mrs. Marrs? The town will listen." Eveline felt the eyes of Sundown like scales. Old men who'd hollered for rope all too recently now looked away. The saloon's owner chewed the inside of his cheek like a man mulling an invoice. Eveline's hand sought the cross at her throat and found the knot still sore from hours of gripping. She thought of Colter's hands, calloused, patient, of Jonah's steady face under the dust. She thought of Luke's raw, honest jaw. She thought of the men the Salt Riders had taken as costs, and the two bodies whose names would no longer be read at supper. Justice had to wait. So did mercy. "I will do what I promised them," Eveline said finally, and her voice carried as if dropping a heavy coin on a table. "I will answer for what Sundown fails to answer. I will serve the reclaim's call when they come. Within reason. I will speak for Colter when he cannot. But more than that," she added, looking to the crowd like someone setting a price the town could not afford to forget. "I want the town to remember the cost of silence. Let this be known. If anyone in Sundown profits from taking men to ledger or rope, their name will be the first written when a debt is called." A silence rose that felt like a held breath. Some men shifted their weight. The sheriff cleared his throat, a small, fatherly sound bent by the ledger's weight. "You paint dangerous lines," he said. "You'll start things." "Then let them start," Eveline answered. "It's time Sundown learned its books." Harlan watched, and for a moment his expression was something like respect. "A promise is good," he said. "We mark it. You keep yours, and we keep our side." He tipped his hat, a curt nod like the closing of a page in a book. Then he led his riders away, the dust swallowing their tracks, leaving a trail that would be read again. The town buzzed like a hive whose cells had been disturbed. Neighbors muttered into sleeves. Children clambered on fences to glimpse the returned man. Eveline sat on the chapel step with Colter's hand in hers. The cross at her throat had become smaller and larger at once, a talisman and a tally. That evening, as sun sank like an ember behind the mesas, Eveline walked Main Street with a slow step. People nodded, some with shame, some with relief. A child pointed and asked the question that contains the world. "Mama, why she cut her hair?" A woman folded the child close and whispered in the child's ear about courage and debts. Eveline's hand found the hair cross. She touched it and felt the ache that belonged to people who choose to carry truth when others will not. The town would cheer the return and forget the price unless someone kept counting. She had decided she would count. The last light slid from the chapel spire like a sigh. At the threshold, Eveline paused and looked back toward the plains, where salt riders rode slow and sure. The horizon held a pale smear of dust, evidence that some books are kept far away, and their keepers might come back to collect. She pressed her palm to the cross and let the wind take the salt and the memory. The story did not end with a single law or a single oath fulfilled. It left the town and its secrets, tangled, heavy, waiting. And Eveline, with the hair cross at her throat, walked into that waiting like someone who knew accounts are often balanced by courage rather than coin.